Bienvenidas, bienvenidos. Columbus was Portuguese. There's a lot of convincing and compelling evidence with regard to this, and we're going to take a look at it today, just in time for El Día de la Raza. But first, this is Latina Literati. Many nations claim Columbus, but what do we really know? We have his own writings, we have the writings of his son Fernando, and we have contemporary writings about who he was and what his claim was with regard to his name and where he came from. What if you just looked at the facts? What if you kind of undid what we were all taught in the classroom? Could a wool merchant, which means that would have been someone who was illiterate, someone who knew nothing of the seas, could they have suddenly shown up and told the most important monarchs at that time in Europe, give me some ships, I'm going to go take a look at what's out there? That's highly improbable. So could he have taken off as a youngster and gone to join what they called corsairs or privateers, which were really just pirates working for different crowns? Yeah, he could have. That's absolutely plausible. But again, really unlikely, because that puts you in a category of people that can never be introduced at court. So just like if you wanted today to be introduced to members of the royal house of Spain or of England or any of the countries that have royal houses, almost impossible. You'd have to have connections really close to that whole court and the whole court etiquette and structure to even be allowed or be invited to anything near the royal houses. And just as it is today, it was even more so in the 1500s. So again, let's just look at the facts. Let's look at what we know. Genoa is in the city-state. In the 1500s, you recall, before the unification of Italy, several hundred years later, every city of importance was its own city-state. And the same was true of the area of Liguria, where Genoa is, in Italy. And so the Ligurian dialect is what a Genovese would have spoken in the 1500s. Incredibly, all of Columbus's writings, everything that we know he wrote, is in Castilian, Portuguese, and what they called Mallorcan, what we now called Catalan. Very similar languages, but all from the Iberian Peninsula. Fascinating. Now, if you speak another language, 2, 3, or 4 languages, amazing, but can you write in those languages? I can be made to be understood in a cafe in a second or third language, but there's no way that I can write letters, especially letters addressed to monarchs and to important dignitaries in those other languages. So all of these indicate that Portuguese and Spanish and Catalan were languages that he spoke all his life. And so that really points to the fact that whether he was born in Genoa or not, whether he was a wool merchant or not, definitely he was not simply a wool merchant. There had to be more to his story. And it's interesting that many of the names in his mother's family are traditional Jewish names like Abraham and Sarah. So fascinating that one of the theories is that he was a converso. So remember, at the time Columbus wants to explore and is proposing the exploration, we're at the height of the anti-Jewish, anti-Muslim edicts in Spain. In fact, the day that Columbus gets the authorization and approval to take his voyage to the Indies, as he thought he was, it is the same day that the Edict of Expulsion, April 1492, is announced and is communicated throughout the Iberic Peninsula. What does that mean? It means that all non-Christians are given a period of time to leave on pain of death. So this makes it really complicated. If you were someone who came from a family of one of these religions that is not Christianity, you would absolutely not want in any way for that to be known. So what are the details, or what are the facts that we know that point to the probability that his family was converso? Converso, or converts, are those that are had either really converted or are trying to hide their true religions. Well, all of his, or the majority of his writings, are in 15th century Spanish. So Spanish today is not what it was in the 15th century. 15th century Spanish is called Ladino. And Ladino is to Spanish what Yiddish is to German. It is what the Sephardim, what the Sephardic Jews spoke, and that is what Columbus wrote in. Really interesting. Also on his private letters, not on the letters to officials or to the court, but on his private letters, he wrote 2 Hebrew words on every single letter. Again, you have to understand, this is the height of anti-Jewish, anti-Muslim. They have just finished the Reconquista. Granada has fallen. Absolutely incomprehensible that anyone would want to identify with the religions that are being cast out, unless you were truly of that group and you wanted to maintain something of your identity. So this smattering of Hebrew that is found in his personal writings is absolutely astonishing within the historical and cultural context of the moment. That he would write Bet and Tha, it's traditional letters that represent the traditional Hebrew invocation of Con la ayuda de Dios, or the Arabic that we still use in Spanish, Ojalá, but in Hebrew it is Bezrat Hashem. So again, fascinating that you have, I think it's 13 letters with these symbols there, meaning in Hebrew, with the help of God, whatever I'm saying in this letter will happen. His signature also had these dots, which are found in Jewish cemeteries and also representative of Hebrew prayers. You just cannot ignore these obvious facts, cannot be ignored. No one would have used those or wanted to be associated with symbols that literally could have meant torture and death at any moment. So to take that risk says something about this person. Really interesting. So again, we know that as a young man, he went to the sea. He was with corsairs, privateers, basically pirates. There's a French pirate by the name of Coulon, and the ship goes down. The French pirate is lost. Fishermen help the survivors. There's a theory that then he takes that name because he never ever referred to himself as Columbus in his entire life. He always referred to himself as Cristobal Colón. So fascinating that there is nothing with regard to the issues that are at the forefront. We know that he goes to Madeira, and there he marries a Portuguese noble woman and has his first son, Diego. She then passes away, and he has a son by a woman by the name of Beatriz, Fernando. And it is Fernando who writes with regard to his father's life and all of his adventures, but even the sons say we know very little about his early life because he never talked about it. That father never felt it necessary to tell his children, I am from wherever. What he did tell them to do is to use the signature that has the Hebrew representation in perpetuity forever. Fascinating. So really interesting to look at what is in front of us, what any one of us can see in these letters. To sail while he's in the company of pirates. We know that he gets to Portugal, where he is trained in navigation and cartology or map reading by conversos. So in other words, people that had fled Spain who were Jewish are training in all of these. Why? Because it is the Jewish merchants who had many contacts and maps through the spice route. Now Venice has taken over that monopoly, but still very interesting that there is a group called the Radanites that were the traditional traders that went from Spain all the way to China and brought back spices in exchange for things like slaves and fur and other things. I think this is a whole area where very little has been brought out, and there should be absolutely more study in it. So what do we know? We know that the head of King Ferdinand's household, the comptroller of all of Aragon, is a converso, a very wealthy man by the name of Luis Santangel. And he and another converso are the ones who put up the money for the first voyage of Columbus. interesting because it is he, Luis San Angel, this converso, arranges the three audiences with the king and the queen Isabella of Castile. So it is through this converso connection that he is able to meet the king and queen and propose this trip to the Indies. You can't just walk into a court. Someone must introduce you. And so it is conversos that introduce him and fund the first journey. Incredibly, the edict that says all Jews and Muslims must leave Spain was absolutely purposeful and is intricately interwoven with that first voyage to the Indies. Why? Because Isabel and Ferdinand were depending on the confiscated property of Jews and Muslims to fund it. The suffering of others is what pays for the voyage that will cause the genocide in the world that Columbus is about to invade. It's beyond anything that we can imagine. But it is important to understand that point in history and what was happening in the Iberian Peninsula. There is, of course, a completely different theory that the Portuguese have put forth. Professor Fernando Bravo of Lisbon University purports that the real name of the person we know as Columbus was Pedro Ataido, and he was a pirate that fled to Castile in the 1400s. We'll soon find out, because some time ago there were DNA tests taken from the tomb of what is purportedly Columbus, his son, and his brother. And so the remains of the three men in those tombs, the DNA was matched, and it is true that those three men are related, closely related. So we know that. What we don't know is whether or not, for example, as the Portuguese say, he was the natural son of the Portuguese royal house. So next stage of the DNA testing is going to look at whether or not the man that we know as Columbus actually was the natural son of one of the royals in the Portuguese house. Fascinating possibility. So we'll have to wait and see. So there is lots to speculate, and there are a lot of things to look at. So I invite you to take a look at some of the things that we have provided for you. And now for my favorite part of the video, the book recommendations. The first book I'm going to recommend is called The Portuguese Columbus by Barreto. It's not a new book, but it's one of the last books that my father discussed with me and gave me before he passed away. So I love this book for a lot of reasons. It's a lot of Portuguese history, but it ties the man we know as Columbus to the Portuguese court in ways that I don't think other historians do. And some people say this is on par with the Da Vinci Code, and that it just rips the veil from everything that we have been told and have assumed for centuries. So highly recommend it, The Portuguese Columbus. And of course, we want you to check your local booksellers, check your local library, and if perchance that's not available, then we always include links in the description box below so that you can purchase them from independent booksellers. The second book I'm going to recommend is called Columbus Was Portuguese by the husband and wife team of Da Silva. He's a doctor, she's a professor, and so together they do a lot of research. And some of the facts that I mentioned to you are from that book. For example, he never used the name Columbus in his entire life. So fascinating to look at what this couple has come up with. Really highly recommended. Again, if this is something that's of interest to you, really would read this book because it's a good one. The final book I'm going to recommend to you is called The Ornament of the World. I've mentioned it before, and it's my favorite book for this time in the Iberian Peninsula. The original is in Spanish, but it's been translated. Again, these are not new books, but they're really worthwhile reading. This talks about the hundreds and hundreds of years where Muslims, Jews, and Christians lived together. Doesn't mean that it was perfect, because the Jews and Christians had to pay a special tax. But they lived in relative tranquility and prosperity. And great men like Moises, Maimonides, and Baruch Spinoza, just amazing philosophers and people came out of this area. Really interesting that it didn't necessarily matter what religion you were, it really was on your competencies, because you have people of all the religions in all different areas, whether you're an advisor to the Caliph or whether you're head of the treasury. All of these were positions that were given to people that were not necessarily Muslim. So again, fascinating story of Andalusia, of Al-Andalus, of Granada, and what it was like during that time, because that gives you the backdrop. You'll remember that Isabel and Ferdinand take Granada. In fact, the first Santa Fe they established outside Granada as their place, as they're attacking Granada. And it is in that court, in that fabulous court, dressed in Moorish garb, where they then take up their residency. So all of the spices, all the cooking, all the traditions that had been part of the Andalus culture are simply adopted as now the Spanish culture. And so when one of the daughters, of course Isabella and Ferdinand, will at 16 be shipped off to England, and she brings all these spices to the British court for the first time. Fascinating. So much to talk about, but I think I'm going to end it here. Thank you so much for this joint journey, and I hope you've enjoyed this content. Let us know what you think of the content and what you'd like us to talk about. We would love to hear from you. We'd love you to subscribe to Latina Literati, and we enjoy preparing these videos for you, and we hope you enjoy watching them. So as always, con mucho cariño, mucho amor, mucho salud. Gracias.